Well, hello everyone. My name is Jacob Kishere, and I'm honored today to be sitting down with Daniel Thorson and Dr. Zak Stein ahead of the upcoming conference, Human Transformation in a Time of Metacrisis, taking place at Harvard University on May 2nd and 3rd. Now, this conference was previously called Education for Flourishing, which I think is relevant to insert here as a third piece of what we have coming up in this conference: human transformation, metacrisis, and the context of education, which of course showed up in Zak's book, Education in a Time Between Worlds. But more pertinently, his forthcoming collaboration, actually now released, I believe, First Principles and First Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Metacrisis, and the World to Come. Daniel's work in The Intimate Mirror is also pulsing out signal of very high fidelity in relation to these themes, exploring the role of the sacred, the role of intimacy and relationship and love in the context of the metacrisis, and I would say human transformation as well. So a lot of excellent work has already been done and is in the room with us. So yeah, I think what I want to do is just kick off by inviting you to speak a little bit, to open about how you begin to approach this matter of human transformation in the metacrisis. Daniel, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was actually through Zak that I began to look at the topic of the metacrisis as fundamentally an educational crisis. I had actually studied, part of my background and work is at the Monastic Academy in Northern Vermont. And I had studied and trained there for about 2 years. And then I left, went back out into the world. And it was after I had left that I first encountered Zak's work. And it helped me recontextualize the significance of that kind of, I didn't see it at the time, but what I would now call a kind of transformational educational space that I could see in retrospect working on me in a certain way. And that upon seeing it in this new light that Zak offered, called me back into the training, actually. So it's through reading his work that I was like, oh, I see what is actually, or one way of looking at what is actually going down there. I want more of that. And actually, more than even for the sake of my own training, I want to be a part of creating educational environments where that kind of depth of transformation happens. Specifically, as I came to see it, the transformation that affords the opening of the eye of value, the development of valueception, the kind of breaking through of the enchantment of disenchantment that is so common in our world today, and that I was raised in. Like, I was raised in a deeply secular, actually academic household. And, by the time I got to Maple, I had a lot of work to do to unwind a kind of implicit nihilism and values irrealism. And so it was a long journey for me. And kind of coming out the other side of that, I can just feel in my own life the significance of awakening to the reality of value. And I very much feel like in my bones that that's a kind of critical reorientation of what education is and is for in the context of the meta crisis.
I encountered the term metacrisis in, I think, 2015. It was actually at an integral theory conference. And that's kind of when I was writing the essays that were eventually published in the book Education in a Time Between Worlds. And so it was at that time that I saw, framed in part by kind of Aurobindo and Wilbur and Gebser, and even people like Dewey and others who saw the kind of current moment of planetization as a kind of like a funnel, like a kind of radical test, like a kind of crisis that required a transformation of human capacity very, very, very fundamentally, moving from sort of like kind of like a deficient, kind of like rational, as Gebser would call it, to like a holistic integral. It's the way I first framed it, if you will. And it was interesting to see also then what I tried to identify in my first book, which I called the education commodity proposition, which was a very specific way of identifying how education specifically had been colonized by the kind of narrow metric optimization generator functions that has destroyed most of the other institutions and led us to Metacrisis. And so I had identified early that testing, feedback loops around testing, monetization, quantification, enabling monetization, reduction of decision making to quantification and monetization, turned it into what had been a relationship of reciprocally valuable intergenerational transmission, became a relationship of transactional, non-mutually beneficial, opposite of what an educational system should be. So crisis of human capability emerges at the same time. There's ecological crisis of politics, crisis of advanced technology. All of these arise at the same time. And so in the context of a conference convened at a graduate school of education at one of the most famous educational institutions in the world, then you would focus on Metacrisis as it exists in education as we know it, meaning specifically schooling as we know it. And so, the crisis of higher education, crisis of modern mass schooling, crisis of advanced technology resulting in kind of the algorithmic destruction of the human mind. These are all very important. I mean, it kind of climaxes with the AI question and the AI and education question. So it's kind of like some of the art, like the pointy tip of the Metacrisis spear kind of gets into the child's life and into the educational ecosystems now in the shape of the most advanced technology ever created, which is this artificial intelligence, which is kind of directly inserted into the nest of socialization, actually welcomed by many educators. So it's pretty do or die with taking the human seriously.
What comes up for you with that, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in this trialogue, and I don't know how relevant it is to the listeners, but I'm reflecting on how much my own life and work is a product of really taking in that analysis. And so I find myself much more on the kind of like responsive solution. Like me and my friends are much more like living in a world where we're already attempting to self-organize in response to the very kind of situation that Zak has done so much work to identify. And I'm reflecting on like, in the context of this conference, actually, maybe it's more important to just really focus on naming that problem very precisely, because it may be that a lot of educators and the folks that are coming aren't yet aware of that way of looking at, what's going down.
It's possible. I mean, I think, in that book, I also lay out the solution, which is this distributed educational hub network, which uses AI in a very different way than it's currently being used to replace mass modern schooling with something that's properly kind of post-industrial digital. So there are solutions talk, absolutely. The problem is that not everyone's agreeing on what the problem is.
Right.
So I think there is a diagnostic moment that needs to be lingered on a little bit here, probably at the conference. But I don't exactly know what to expect. I have the last slot of the day, so I'm going to mostly listen and then speak into that to try to weave things together. And then the second day is a more unstructured kind of unconference, as it were. So there'll be a lot of room for different views, but hopefully there's some agreement on the overarching frame of the meta crisis as kind of distinct and superordinate to other crises such as environmental, political, ecological, social justice, like etc. Right? And so that's a complex opening in a space often wanting to lock down on one of those as primary.
Yeah, I think, and Jacob, feel free to re-steer if you feel like there's a place this conversation wants to go. But one thing I get curious about, Zak, is what you didn't mention in your kind of architecting of the problem and possible solution is your work with the Center for World Religion and Philosophy and the kind of architecting of the cosmoerotic humanist religious vision. And I'm curious, like, how that fits for you in all that you just said, and like how you would see deploying a kind of distributed schooling infrastructure of the sort that you
So
mentioned.
when you think about solutions, most people think about solutions in terms of kind of content structure, economics of it, assessment of it. But there's actually this question of the content of the curriculum itself, right? And this is one of the things that modern schooling has attempted to pretty systematically avoid discussing. They want to allow there to be, in a sense, a value agnosticism with regards to what characterizes the primary content of the curriculum. And this, of course, comes back to the key move, right? Separation of church and state, which said that the public schools are not religious institutions, and therefore, in a sense, do not answer the question, what is the good life? The question, the way you answer the question, what is the good life, is answered by family / religion / civil society. School is preparing you to be a citizen / consumer, right? And that was kind of the modern, I don't know, truce or something, which allowed there to be all these different visions of the good life held within some kind of container of a just, equitable access to a playing field of opportunity. But that kind of has very much broken down. Most of the rest of the world, I believe, has gone part post-secular. This is what China has done. This is what Russia has done. This is what India has done. Turkey. So there's a deep question about how the West and America specifically, and the world eventually, thinks about what values are at the center of education. That's a simple question. And there's a whole like subset of educational theory, mostly held by kind of conservatives, speaking about values in education, which is just like they're kind of like a list of values you ought to have in education. Integrity and be honest and make your bed and that kind of stuff. And that's key, but the list of values is very different from value realism, which is what you were pointing to, the absence of, Daniel, like, which is to say discussion as to how it is that value is real. Is it that I should be integrist because that's what we say, or that's what advances you in society, or some relativistic answer, and some other culture, some other person might not think that, and that's their truth, and this is my truth, and the values are relative? Or are we going to move towards a culture that transmits value realism, which suggests that no, there's a very specific kind of discourse we can have that clarifies value, that clarifies desire, that clarifies what the human will ought to be about, and therefore what the good life is, and therefore what the core of the education is, regardless of how it's administered or packaged or assessed or funded. And so this becomes this thing which is hard to touch in educational theory in part, outside of like consensus about the kind of civil religion, as it were, or kind of like 21st century skills or socio-emotional skills or some other thing that we kind of like slip in place of this deeper question about fundamental value in education, which you can't really socialize successfully with that. So that's where the project of David J. Temple, Gaffney, Wilbur, the Center for World Philosophy is one attempt to answer the kind of question that has to be answered if we want to have a future for education, beyond just technical solution into actually better curriculum, better content of curriculum, meaning learning process of society accomplished. Kids are learning better things than their parents learned, right? Which is what we want, as opposed to learning process of society failing, kids getting stupider than parents, right? Which is, you could argue, currently what the situation is. So that's a roundabout answer, in a sense, that values are so fundamental to education, and yet so difficult to address outside of frameworks that are unavoidably religious in
Right.
their connotation. And everyone who is deep in education knows this. This is why Dewey made no qualms about it. Dewey was like, teachers are the servants of God, like actualizing the evolution of value. This would be Dewey. He was a Hegelian who had mystical experiences, who really believed, and at the time was correct in believing, that something radical was happening with the public education system and the literacy and these huge attempts to bring in all of these people from uneducated kind of masses, huge immigration into the United States. And so it was this amazing thing. But it was a time when you had what we've called at the center of the common sense sacred axioms of value, right? The truths that we hold to be self-evident, which don't need articulate religious justification, but which we kind of all agree on. And that allowed America to kind of like thrive to a certain extent. Postmodernism, kind of late stage extractive capitalism, and then you have the Metacrisis and consensus on the common sense kind of values breaking down. And so the reconstruction of the conversation about value is necessary, and that requires engaging the religious traditions, but also what we've learned since then. And so that's the core of the curriculum. It's one way to frame a core curriculum. And without it, you end up, it's hard to justify a lot of what we want to preserve, let's say in liberal arts curriculums. And it's hard to justify training engineers to be humanists rather than just to be, max efficiency, profit maximizing guys, right? And then, of course, when AI is able to do many of the things that are really automatable, you're left with the human as the being with the eye of value that can explore value. Right, which is another thing. If we don't explore that in education, kids get up into a space of hyper entertainment and they have no discernment around value, and they're lost. So yeah, there's a lot. There's a ton to say there.
Yeah, I'm struck hearing this by the presence of Socrates, and a sense of this as like coming back to a very foundational rendering of what education can be about, and that sense of the Socratic dialogue and the encounter with Socrates, the relationship with him as educator, is something that is fundamentally about opening the eye of value.
So through a maieutic method, right? Through a questioning, drawing out, a maieutic and a birthing process. It's a brilliant kind of like transfer. And again, Socrates, so it's like Athens, Jerusalem, right? Then you get the Indus River Valley, and other places where you get the emergence of the axial traditions, which kind of evolve this conversation about value. And then there's a modern evolution, and then the conversation about value requires a crisis to now clarify it again.
Exactly.
And we talk about a world philosophy or a world religion as a context for diversity, meaning it's not the emergence of some totalitarian world religion, actually, God forbid. It is something quite different, which is a kind of unity in plurality, what we sometimes call the unique self-symphony of different traditions of that tell stories of value, right? So this is, again, kind of deep up and into what is one frame for thinking about a future of what it could be. Now, in other contexts, you could take up one of the traditions itself and reconstruct it. there's a future for Catholicism, there's a future for Buddhism. It's a complex conversation in terms of the future of education. In the West, we like to think we can kind of get rid of it. And then you look at places like India and you realize it's not, you're not getting rid of it. It's in fact, there's a reconstruction that needs to occur. So this is on the table now. This is all occurring while advanced technology runs wild and we create a demi AI god. So there's that as well.
Yeah, just a couple more things coming through here for me. I mean, one is a sense of like that our current educational paradigm and culture prepares us very poorly to be able to undergo that kind of mediation of different religions, of different traditions, of different philosophies, and also to have the capacity of mind and also to do that relationally with others, to explore relationally how to go in and to integrate that which is already there in a way that isn't just kind of like a dogmatic, like throwing on the clothes of the past, but actually like, you know, forging them together into a new garment that serves for the current situation. I think the question that's really pointed for me, Daniel, and maybe you can come in on this too, is like, how do we open the eye of value? Because that sounds like that's really at the base of a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what I received as one of the big pieces from Zak's work is like you can I kind of hold it as a sort of superordinate goal as like let's open the eye of value in culture as individuals. And how do we do that? I mean, part of it is convening conversations, right? Like this in my dream world, one of the things that might happen at this conference is that educators that are there kind of reconsider where the work is to be done. Because I think, if we take what Zak is saying seriously, we can't just create curriculums. We can't actually make use of the technology that is being developed right now until we clarify and open the eye of value, until we like start to enter ourselves into a kind of values realism. That's the basis from which we can create in a trustworthy way. And so like, how do we open the eye of value? Like in my, like, I would love to have many, 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 many people working on exactly that question across many different lineage streams, competing and collaborating to find out like, what does it take? And in a sense, we can look back at all the religious traditions, all the great traditions as being in service to that question. And, and once we take on that view, we can look at and make use of all of the beautiful work that has been done by, many geniuses throughout history to try to answer that very question. But until the like network of educators that is kind of controlling the dials on how people receive education kind of wake up to the reality of that as being the situation, we're kind of like not able to move in that way. But, from my perspective, certainly like there's dialogical and kind of logoic architecture to opening the eye of value that I think like Zak and Mark have done so well to explicate, and many other teachers too. But then there's like, transformational practice that I would love to see more a part of, everyday education, meaning not meditation to improve your attentional training so you can do your homework better, but as a mode of self-inquiry and revelation so that you can get more in touch with the living reality of goodness, truth, and beauty as it flows in the world. How do we support students in escaping like parasitic processing, like left hemispheric capture? Can we identify that as being kind of a danger that we want to educate people with the tools and resources to escape? All of these things kind of flow from that initial reorientation of values realism and valueception. The eye of value as being kind of a fundamental capacity that we want education to support. And so, it's all of that. It's a big question. It's the question in a sense.
There's a question. I would say it's worth kind of just clarifying, slowing down a little bit what we mean by eye of value, because it's again, who knows who's, or we're speaking out into the void, who knows who's listening, right? So there's this question of eye of the senses is the one we kind of know and trust and actually can discuss fairly well with each other. Like there's a tree there, there's a tree there. Right now, the fact that I call it a tree brings us up into the eye of mind. Right? But the eye of the senses is just the differential responsiveness of your ears, your eyes to the world. Uh, the eye of the mind is what we usually peak with science. That's like the pinnacle eye of mind. So then you look at the tree and you talk to me about how the tree works. Photosynthesis, fucking, the roots draw the water, it grows. It's like this tree is really old. You cut it open to see the rings, right? Like the eye of the mind allows you to hold it. Like this is a deciduous tree, like it's got acorns or whatever, right? So you're just all day about the mind, right? Then you have the eye of, then there's the eye of value. And then there's the eye of spirit or contemplation. So, right. But let's do the eye of value. Right? The eye of value is a question of what is that tree worth?
Mm.
Now, the eye of mind and sense can reduce that question to price or utility. What is it worth to me? I could build a house with it. I could sell it for lumber, etc. Right. But this other question is the intrinsic value of the tree. Can you perceive the intrinsic value of the tree? We're most used to, and then most people who can know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you think it's a crazy question, but you can really understand how to understand turning it into lumber and selling it for $600 or something.
Mm.
That's clear. That's a value theory of tree. Right? Boom, $600 from a tree lumber. But this question of actually, no, there's a way to relate to the tree where you're saying there's a reason for this tree to be here, something like that, where there is a intrinsic value to the existence of this tree per se. It is actually infinitely valuable in the financial sense in a way because this vector of value is so orthogonal. There's this whole other thing, the holistic perception of the tree, in fact, which couldn't isolate it from the environment such to turn it into lumber. You'd see that the tree holds the soil together, the tree houses the birds, the tree gives out oxygen. Photosynthesis is a process we actually cannot create in a laboratory. That's very, very, very complicated to understand. That the earth is full of trees which all unite to give us life. So there's this other way to view this thing as somehow fundamentally intrinsically valuable. Specifically, the uniqueness of this tree, on deep into the eye of value, the eye of spirit or contemplation. And this is kind of like application of, I don't know, medieval language, if you will. So bear with us. This would see the tree as valuable as everything else. So that the tree kind of is outshined by the universal presence of infinite value. And this is a confusion people have: eye of value, eye of spirit, because the eye of spirit, me and the squirrel and the tree are of equal value because we're all one in spirit, which is actually an incredibly liberating insight. But from the eye of value isn't quite right. If you have to kill one of those things, you do not kill the human before you kill the squirrel. Because there's discernment of value. Not everything is as valuable as everything else. Whereas the eye of spirit, kind of absolute truth, is in a sense leveling those distinctions beyond that story into a place of just everything's united in one spirit, which you have to be able to see. Because you have to be able to see that even things that ostensibly have no value actually are infinitely valuable, which means utter respect for all beings, even though you still organize. So this is what it means to reconstruct value theory. And there's been shades of it, but specifically the exercise, which was a part and parcel of socialization and remains usually part and parcel of most healthy socialization, is just the ability to be like, that is beautiful. And I can tell the difference between what is beautiful and what is not. And that's not my opinion, man. Like, if you find that beautiful and this ugly, there's like at minimum, we're not going to get along, probably, like at some base level in terms of where we want to be and like what we want to see and what we appreciate. But at max, there's also maybe something I have to explain to you. Like, no, you're not seeing. You're not. Let me show you. Look how you didn't notice this and all of that. And now all of a sudden you see how incredibly precious and beautiful this tree is over the, I don't know, just a TikTok video or something. So which is representation of pseudo value or anti-value, which can destroy your ability to perceive and discern value. That's where we talked about the eye of anti-value, then opening. So yeah, so that's just like from the eye of value out across all the eyes, and then you have to see that there's a pedagogy that has long existed that works across all those eyes. As modernity emerged, there was a truncation of those ones, which you could have reasonable discourse about for a bunch of reasons. The separation of the value spheres is a long, I think, sociological conversation about why it would be that we would want to separate and kind of relegate certain things to private realms where you kind of have opinion, and then other things like engineering and science where we all agree on that. That's just kind of, and I'll say one more thing and then give it back to Jacob, which is that with the eye of the mind and the eye of the senses, especially in engineering, science, places like this, we know that we can have better or worse conversations about a shared object of concern, like this bridge. Like, will this bridge stand or not stand? You want to build it out of toothpicks. I want to build it out of steel. I am correct. You are incorrect. This is something we hash out in the eye of mind, the eye of senses. Right? So something similar exists with the eye of value, which is to say there are non-arbitrary conversations you can have about the nature of value. And that was long what education was about. Late in the game we are now, where there is a belief that, well, we can have these conversations about engineering and science and stuff. Once we get into these other domains, it's like everything's kind of up for grabs. And there's a bunch of reasons why that simply does not work. And you can't run a civilization or an educational system on the idea that value is at the basis. If you really believe in something strongly and have very strong values, you've somehow been tricked, is basically the idea, because it's all arbitrary conversations over there. So you can't, in any reasonable way, hold a strong value commitment. I can totally, in a reasonable way, hold a strong commitment to the steel bridge being better than the toothpick bridge, but I cannot hold a strong commitment to. So you're seeing the problem here, and yeah.
Daniel?
Yeah. I find it difficult in this conversation because I find my work taking place in the wake of this analysis. And so like I feel a sense of affirmation, and I'm like, yep, this is how, and I think part of it for me is, I guess what I get curious about, Zak, as you share all this, it's like you've also written about the sort of hollowing out of teacherly authority, and maybe you want to like talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that, as I like look at the world from this perspective, that seems like a real challenge is that if we like start to operate from this premise, I imagine will become clear that actually there's a poverty of people with refined and clarified valueception, that their eye of value, even as educators, is not open in the profound way that would afford constructing reliable curriculum on top of. And so it's like there's a kind of like, before we can even get to reformatting the educational system, there's like a transformation needs to take place just within the network of people who are holding the kind of future of education. And I'm curious how you...
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is the case with all education reform, is that you have to also simultaneously educate the teachers and the parents and others, because they're the ones who ultimately have to embody and deliver the curriculum. So absolutely, you would have to have a generation of teachers change in their own lives and practices. And again, you can't really eliminate any of the eyes. You can kind of, so there's a kind of thing you do in some of the religious traditions, which is a pointing out instruction, right? Which is pointing to a quality that already exists in your experience that's important to note. And value is like that. The value is something that's just there in front of you.
Right.
So the eye of value is not something that doesn't exist. You have to like create and like put on some like appendage or something. It's there, and I'm not correcting you, Daniel. I'm kind of telling you something you already know. And so what that means is that a lot of the problem is actually just literally just distraction, like literally just advertising, and intentional disruption of the nervous system's normal patterns to put it in a position to receive pseudo value, basically.
Yeah.
So one of the first steps, just general advice, is tech detox
Mm,
for school ecosystems. If you want to think about that, if we're just focusing on graduate school of education, we're talking about teachers here. The first thing to think about is real digital literacy. And given what we know about screen use and a whole bunch of other things, it's pretty clear now what needs to occur, which is no phones in schools
mm,
and very minimal screen time,
mm.
and a few other odds and ends, which largely are hard to implement under current conditions because of the ubiquity of the technology. So I think there's a certain type of awareness of those things, which is like the first step towards freeing awareness to then engage in the experiments of value. And one of the classic things is why nature immersion education is so important, because it kind of stares you in the face. But another thing is why movies and superhero movies are so popular. Another thing is stories of value. Like if you think about the when curriculums contained training in the eye of value, what did it look like? It looked like stories, stories of exemplary behavior, stories of bad behavior, stories that allow you to extract from them these principles of value. And so it's like a simple thing to say, but it's also very deep, which is that especially in early education, the way one gets a sense of what it means to live an exemplary life or to engage in a life that pursues value is from the stories that you're told. And now we have to think about, where are the predominantly kids being told stories? In school, they're not told stories. So, they're supposed to learn what happened, like history. Stories they get on TV, stories they get, cartoons, Disney, where they're getting their stories. So there's this thing about the reclaiming of story in education, which again sounds almost too simple. But if you look at the state of kids' books, you might know what I'm talking about as well. Yuval Harari's kids' book being perhaps the greatest example. If you're not aware that Yuval Harari has a kids' book, where he tries to explain to kids that any story you might believe in and value and think your life is about is made up and meaningless. And that's our superpower. That is the human superpower. It is uniting people under meaningless stories, meaning stories of value and what we all value. We all value this, but at the end of the day, there's no such thing as real value. So it's this deep, weird moment in culture where we're willing to teach kids to be nihilists. Whereas most of the stories we told kids were precisely the opposite. Please believe in something. Like, the universe is good. You are meant to be here. Like, there's a reason the humans are here, and there's ways to be that are, rewarded, and there are ways to be that should be avoided. And those things really matter to the universe, not just to mom and dad and to some subset of people in our neighborhood.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like I'm ranting a little bit here. I'm not sure. I'm not clear that this will be the theme of conversation at the conference in terms of it maybe lingering on the diagnostic moment. Some of what we're talking about here is a little bit of the way forward, which is not just changing the structure and context of educating, but actually changing the content of education, which is the focus of education. And that's pretty deep. And
Yeah.
again, it's not crazy. Like there was a values in education thing. Like Kohlberg saw this problem back in the 60s. And then Dewey saw it way back in the day. In
Yeah.
terms of so
Yeah, I have
And
next step in the conversation, but I want to pause here because, to your point, I think I would take us further into the response, and I want to see Jacob if you have a place you want to direct us instead.
sure, I'm definitely going to be moving in the direction of response too. So
Oh,
let's go that. And just to note, like I'm seeing this with my own nephews. They're not even watching cartoons anymore. The majority of what they watch is like YouTube videos created by other people in their early 20s, which are like weird like flip tricks, and like it's all like content creatorship directed at children. So in a sense, the technology that's liberating us to not watch TV and watch really dope podcasts and tune into all this great stuff is also has this inverse, which is just a gargantua of garbage.
mm,
Um, for me, like this is showing up in my direct experience because I'm exploring men's work as like a key para or inter-educational context where some of these things can happen with respect to intergenerational transmission, with respect to creating a context where like there's a kind of sense of the sacred being cultivated throughout, like extra to the particularity of what we focus on. And then the other term that comes to mind is around initiation
mm,
and context of initiation. And I think that's really important because, like, we can talk a lot about transformation, but there I feel like there has to come a point also of like talking from transformation, like, oh, this is actually real, like really, really deep fundamental transformations in the ground of your being, of your awareness, of your relationship to yourself and life can occur, even at a physical and energetic um, level. And I'm struck that so often the case, like actually trying to communicate more ideas about the metacrisis or more objects of concern to somebody is really, really just irrelevant and useless insofar as their like energetic body and world is clogged up with a lot of trauma and a lot of things that would prevent that actual growth and capacity. Um, so yeah, that's what's coming up for me here.
yeah, and I would say from the kind of analysis we've been exploring so far, if your eye of value is closed, in other words, if you're like a kind of a nihilist, then news about the extinction of a new species kind of doesn't have a place to land in your worldview. It's just like more information. I like when I used to receive that information when I was kind of functioning in this way as a kind of, I would say, pejoratively now, a kind of cultural nihilist or postmodernist. It was like I would read this stuff and I'd be like, in an abstract way, I would think that's bad, but it wouldn't really function as a kind of feedback mechanism for me deepening into relationship with sacred world or the reality of value. And I think that, part of the, I'm more involved with adult education, and the flip that I see that's necessary there is the flip that I went through of like, I was raised in a kind of postmodern secular worldview, and then I had to go through a transformational experience that sort of like broke me open, woke me up into a world that is saturated with value and all of the duties and demands that that world makes on me. And part of it, yes, is just like straightforwardly like transformational practice. But I want to share an experience that happened to me in engaging with Zak's work. Actually, he hosted a kind of a retreat where some of these teachings and like frames around value and anti-value and anthropontology were shared. And what I found is that when I received that, what on one level is actually very conceptually based sort of architecture, it then allowed me to start to know what I already knew, but did not give myself permission to live according to. And so I think there's something about like inserting these memetics, these views as a kind of coherent architecture for people to start to re-engage or engage with the life that they're already living. Like, we know that a tree has infinite worth, but we don't allow ourselves to know that for all kinds of reasons. And so I think that there's something about that, like, flip out of nihilism and into values realism, and the significance of a coherent conceptual architecture that skillfully responds to, like, the kind of critique of values realism that was offered in postmodern philosophy, that, like, almost in a very strange way immediately enables a kind of transformation. I feel it, in my own life, and I've seen it with other people that I work with. It's like, I feel like I'm giving people permission sometimes to love. And they're like, once that permission is given, they're just like off to the races. So that makes me hopeful to reflect on it like that, not as like a deficiency, but as a kind of latency, actually.
Would you say, Daniel, that some kind of cracking open was essential in the transition?
At times it was necessary for me. I don't know that it's necessary for everybody. But I know in my own life, part of why I didn't let myself acknowledge the, like, felt sense reality of, say, like, the destruction of species was because it was overwhelmingly painful. And so I think there was a kind of protective measure that my psyche might have invoked to obstruct the flow of that information and sensing, like the recognition of that.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so, and that did break me a number of times as I started to open in that direction.
Yeah, I think I'm holding the sensibility that, I mean, going to Harvard for this conference is going to be the first time I've gone to an actual university since like 2018. And in that whole intervening period, I've had a sense that real education is happening for me at somewhere else. Um, and so, like, I'm sort of opening myself to the possibility that, hey, maybe there's some turning point possible, or at least hinted at or pointed towards by the gathering of this conference. But from my standpoint, the ontological shifts and changes and the capacity to hold space for those, and as an educator, like, I don't know that I would uh, find that. At least I certainly did not encounter it, and I wouldn't expect to encounter it in most university professors. Nor is it considered part of the purview of what they're doing. It may just be that they're like a super excellent professor and they have this extra curricular capacity to tend to the psycho social spiritual development of the students, but it's really not their pay grade. And their desk is filled with other things, presumably. And so again, it's like, is there a need for para-educational contexts in which that can occur?
Totally. I mean, Harvard is a very, very big, complex place, and it is in the throes of I'd say, mental health crisis among students. If you look at especially the high-end competitive Ivy League undergrad schools, you find a lot of use of psychiatric services. And this speaks to your point that it's just not their professor's job to hold it. And then they're in dorms and they're alienated and they're not from. So it's just, you can see that this is something needs to give, at least in the context of that undergraduate thing. But then, of course, I mean, you're going to find some of the greatest thinkers in the world at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Places like, and so like this, like engineers, legal scholars, economics people. So you have to kind of think about the fact that that thing is so big and old and powerful. And it attracts many of the best people now. Are there problems with the legacy academic institutions? Huge problems, huge problems. And that's just, obviously given the mental state of the majority of the students. Clearly, they haven't solved a lot of problems. And then this deeper question of, and this may be something I would want to get into at the conference, which is that when you think of the metacrisis frame, it includes the polycrisis frame in a sense, because it includes all the different crises occurring. political, ecological, kind of violence, technology, energy, like all that. But then it also includes these generative dynamics, which are these underlying drivers that would explain why all of that continues and why all of that continues to get worse, and why even though we've tried to stop it for decades now, where it's actually still getting worse, all of that. So the question is, where did those problems come from? Then you think, where did the people in the most advanced organizations in the world who are responsible for the planetary scale actions that brought us to the point of ecological and political crisis, where did the people come from who were in there? And then you just have to start looking at places like Harvard. So you have to start looking at places like Yale and start like the financial crisis of 2008, 2012. There are several major financial crises. The people that run these institutions graduated from our best colleges and A-star tests. So then there's this question of, the thing being broken, not only not serving the needs of its students in terms of their souls and minds and giving them access to value, but then also not actually serving the ends of humanity by graduating people up into, these extractive, kind of predatory positions. So that's the problem. But that said, like, if you want to study plasma physics, man, like, you're not gonna like do that on YouTube. I mean, you'll do that to a certain extent on YouTube, but you need equipment. And like, where do you get theoretical physics equipment at the scale needed to do this? You have to go up and into these very big, kind of federally funded physics labs that are tied to places like Berkeley and elsewhere. This is true for other projects as well. But now if you're into men's work, for example, and you want to study archetypal psychology and do other stuff like that, then you're not going to be at Harvard. Specifically, you're going to be somewhere quite different, which is worth saying. And so I'm curious how the conference unfolded as well. And excited to see the meta-crisis frame potentially emerge as a way to integrate some of the values that are disparate now in higher education. Very important, because there was a galvanization around the ecological crisis in a lot of ways. Like the University of Vermont, I think it was the case that like every major you had, irrespective of what the major was, had to somehow relate to the environmental crisis. Right now, that's actually not quite right. It actually is a little bit misunderstanding the number of other crises that are occurring, which other majors might be more directly appropriate, to address. So similar with social justice and other things, right? So there's this need to like diversify the values as we integrate them in some higher frame, which ends up being the meta-crisis frame, potentially because it's such a large umbrella and it focuses both on immediate risks, which need immediate mitigation, which means direct activist work now, and the generative dynamics, which is like long-term transformation, which means deep design work, thinking, education over longer time cycles. And it includes all of our favorite rolling catastrophes of climate, demographics, the environment, economics, energy. Like we just list that off, and we've actually got a pretty good taxonomy of crisis types, risk taxonomy. But the broader point here is that, there's a way that higher education could be shifted from being one of the things that's actually speeding the meta-crisis up, if you will. And again, I'm taking a very critical view here. There's obviously parts of the academy that are not doing that, that are doing good. But on the whole, if you look at the broad sweep, again, back to where did the economic crisis come from? It was the graduates of our best schools who took that argument. You could go from higher education, perhaps the whole education system itself being kind of one of those things that's causing the meta crisis, into something that would be actively working to mitigate and transform. That would be the idea. And this is what the goal was with the environmental education movement. We will turn education, instead of producing wasteful consumers, education will become the thing that produces mindful consumers. And instead of mindfully taking gas, the consumer will now not do that. Instead, what happened is that we just took it and was guilty about it. Right? But so there's this question of what would be a reorientation that would be deep enough in conjunction with other things occurring, like legal changes and technological changes. So it's a very complex question of the role of higher education in a time of rapid transformation and transvaluation of the culture.
I think one of the pieces that came up for me in one of the last dialogue that I had in this series with Professor Sherry Lee, who's going to be at the conference, what she brought to the table, which I found really striking, was this sense of like, how is this sort of human transformation in the metacrisis going to actually trickle down into the masses as such and not remain an elite educational concern? And I know I kind of touched on this already of like, if you, as she put it, like if you bring this down to the everyday person who is grappling with the reality of living in the world today, whether it be paying rent or addiction or whatever other problems are dogging them, the metacrisis frame improperly applied becomes this extra object of concern, which is just like, well, why would I even have space for that, and how does that help me? And as Daniel said, you don't have the emotional architecture to usefully land that. So I'm wondering then, like, if it's not an intellectual layer that's being added on, what is the kind of like localized, like meta and local, I guess, cosmo local rendering of this that can trickle down in a way that actually sort of empowers, enables choice and capacity for ordinary people in a way that kind of fractally also serves the function of creating an address of the meta crisis across the board. Go for it, Daniel.
Zach.
Can you repeat the question? No, I'm just kidding. Let's see here. A couple of things to say on that question, which is a great question. The masses, the term the masses is a strange term. It actually was created along with other apparatuses of the nation state pretty late. We're talking like just pre-World War One. You get the idea of the masses as a object of basically mass manipulation or mass hysteria. The point is that the masses are the kind of irrational base of the society who somehow like doesn't have access to the reasonable means of self-control and need to be therefore kind of like reined in and through advertising or mass schooling, or even the term mass schooling, of course, right? And so I think one answer to this question is like that frame actually needs to break, and it's already broken. That's one of the things that the internet did. It's like if you're forgive me, if you're kind of mainstream legacy media left, you think the masses exist. If you're in this kind of insurgency that's coming from the right, which is this distributed, non-centralized media apparatus, then you're kind of in a very different world in terms of you've disaggregated the masses into actually quite specific and active clusters of resistance, rather than having it. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all that, but it's a deep issue. So there's something about the meta crisis having to, in a sense, break down some of these distinctions between elite and ordinary. And then, of course, a lot of the world, most of the world, not on the internet, right? India is huge. It's huge. China's huge. Unbelievable. Like more honor students than we have students, just like statistics wise. So when we think about like who are the everyday numbers wise, we're very far from their experiences. And so there's a certain responsibility that has to be taken by those people who are in a situation to know a lot about the state of the world, disproportionately resourced, disproportionately privileged, etc., to actually act in a way that only they can act in. um, and this is important. I mean, we need to scale and we need to have the notion of trickle down, but then there also needs to be, well, your job up there isn't just to trickle it down. Your job up there is to act as a lead actor in space that very few people are privileged to have access to, which means a type of courage on behalf of those who do not have voices in those spaces, rather than hoping that it trickles down to them and do whatever you do to keep your elite status. And so it's a complex dynamic where that needs to be broken down. At the same time, we have to admit the current hierarchy and access to positions of power. And a lot of what needs to occur in quote unquote metacrisis education is adult education with existing very powerful people. People who might go to, Harvard Business School or something like that, who are going to go lead billion-dollar businesses or something. Those people need to think in a very different way about the nature of value, for example, and the nature of the current risk landscape and a whole bunch of other things that they're going to responsibly steward this much wealth. And what I say to that guy, I need to be able to say to him, if you will, or her, in a way that's very, I mean, am I worried about if it trickles down? Yes, but at the same time, I need to get this person to understand very concretely what's going on there, their responsibility. And so, in a sense, I've often said that for those people who are quite remarkably privileged to be in a position to worry about this stuff, they're the ones who I would say this to. I don't bring this to people who don't take it upon themselves to already be kind of worrying about it. Right. So if you're self-selecting into the conference, then you're telling me that you are in a position to want to worry about this, right? But I'm not going to start kind of putting this and proselytizing this and putting this in front of people who have other things to worry about. Now that said, I'm also not going to infantilize them and not have a conversation with them if it comes to it. And again, I tend to err on the side of being quite frank with people about what I think the situation is in the world. So that's a little bit of an answer to your question, Jacob, which is in a roundabout way. This comes from the research I did on propaganda, which is where you get like people like Bernays and Laswell creating this idea of the mass. And I think this got Le Bon and then other early psychoanalysts who studied mob behavior. It's actually a whole other thing. We now call it egregores.
Yeah, thank you for that wizardly alchemical deconstruction of my entire question, Zach. That's very helpful, and helps to brings me back to the center of my own direct experience in a certain way. Daniel, I wonder if, building on the question and the deconstruction of the question, some of your recent writings, particularly around love as a sacred attractor, as a third attractor, I think this is what I'm really hearkening towards in the question, is like, to what extent is love and the relationship between love and choice something that can be this kind of like available and something that can be tended and cultivated at every level of the world as we encounter it.
Yeah, I mean, this is my dream, I suppose. My hope is that I've participated in decentralized networks of various kinds, and there's always a question of like what organizes decentralized collectives. And if we take the perspective of valueception and the eye of value seriously, my offering and my sense of it, and I've also received this from Zak's work, it's like what ought to organize distributed intelligence is a clear relationship with value and sacred world. And so, and what is a human network that has the eye of value open? Kind of, what does it feel like? It feels like love. It feels like intimacy. And so the, visionary sense of what needs to be born is self-organizing collectives of humans that are organized by love and the intelligence of love. And I have direct experience on small scales that such networks can act in extraordinary ways, can move into adjacent possibilities that are closed to networks of people that are organized on the basis of power and kind of delusion. And so, that is much of the work that I do, which obviously I don't expect Harvard to kind of enter into during this conference. But it's I think for me it's important to name the trajectory, at least for of what my heart longs for in conversations like this. And yeah, I'm really excited to. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. I'm excited to see how Harvard digests the kind of topics that we're talking about, for sure.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. And, I'll just note that it's already come up in my last dialogue, this question of where does love fit into education, and to what extent do our institutions actually serve any kind of understanding of what love is. So I don't think it's as far off the agenda as you might have postulated. But with that, I sense we might be drawing to a close. I wonder if there's any closing remarks from either of you with respect to this dialogue and looking forward to conference in the year ahead.
I mean, on that last point, I can't help the role of love in education. I can't help but think of the Lewis Mumford quote, where in the 60s, maybe 71, he was talking about computers replacing teachers. He was talking about basically computers replacing teachers. And his main argument was, in fact, that a computer cannot love you. And so therefore a computer could never actually basically have what I would call teacherly authority, meaning that you can interact with a machine, but you can't have an attachment relationship to a machine without being delusional. And so very interesting. In 71, he said that, and it hinged on this question, which is love in education, that in fact, the main way, the main door into real learning for anybody is love. Love for the subject, love for the teacher, love for the process of learning. The question of my kid can't learn math almost is never correct. It's usually that your kid can't imagine what it would be like to be someone who loves math. Like it's out of their imaginal personality landscape. They're just like, what? Like, math is this thing. I'm not that thing. Like, but they can do it. Absolutely. Like, but the main question in most learning is that it's that, do you understand yourself as someone who loves this? Do you experience this as love? Are you in the process of kind of eros value with this process of learning? And absent that, you're not going to have it. So then these things that trick you into attachment relationship, something kind of deeply disturbing about the advent of the AI tutoring system, designed to trick you into thinking it loves you. Now, of course, we started that with schooling, meaning like clearly your mom's not tricking you into thinking she loves you. The one room schoolhouse lady, she seems to actually kind of love you too, right? And then you get up into industrial factory schooling, and you're one brick in the wall, Pink Floyd, and you're not. There's no sense like, yes, you're responsible for me, which is weird. You're responsible for me and my learning, but you do not love me. And in fact, somehow like simulate loving me by attending to me in this kind of sadistic way. So this idea that we can do education without love, and in fact, with some weird simulation of it, we're kind of like peaking. Like that's like we're peeking into a world where that is the main modality. So I kind of want to end with that because that's likely what I would speak about at the conference. It's on my mind. I think it's one of the most urgent things that I'm in a position to work on with regards to the Metacrisis. I don't know that I can slow down the fracking and stuff, but I think I can possibly raise enough awareness about the dangers of large language models and chatbots and anthropomorphic tutoring systems to young minds. Seems like a no-brainer. So that would be a massive opportunity to raise awareness on that.
I think I'll end with just hearing Zak say that. Just how grateful I am to have entered into an educational space in which love was the actual ground of the transformation. I just, feel really grateful, and feel and want more such spaces to proliferate in our culture. And so I pray that this conference and this conversation creates the conditions for that.
Wonderful. Thank you both for joining me today. It's been an absolute privilege. And please, if you're struck by this conversation, tickets are available now, so you can join us on the day for more conference and unconferencing at Harvard on May 2nd and 3rd, and the link will be included. Thank you for listening.